Call it speed dating diplomacy. In Geneva, real estate magnate Steve Witkoff playing lead U.S. negotiator with Iran in one room, while in another acting as broker for the hard bargaining between Russia and Ukraine. We'll ask how the Ukrainians feel about it, especially when the mediator's boss piles on fresh pressure on them. And what about the Kremlin's envoy? This time it was a revisionist historian who spouts the Greater Russia line of Vladimir Putin. And yet, even though Ukrainians are feeling the heat during a winter left in the cold by relentless attacks on their power grid, Kyiv's also found a way to get into the good graces of pro-Trump tech titans, particularly with the shutting of Elon Musk's Starlink low-orbit satellites. That's enabled counteroffensives in the past week. Still, ahead of that fourth anniversary on February 24th of Vladimir Putin's bid to take the Ukrainian capital, both sides reeling from a meat grinder of a war with lasting consequences. It's been said that it's politically impossible for Putin to quit now. But how viable is it to keep on fighting? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Russia, Ukraine, and the fight for Trump's attention. With us from Washington, he was U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2003 to 2006, retired diplomat John Herbst. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
From Geneva, we're back in 2022. He resigned in protest against the war in Ukraine. Former Russian diplomat Boris Bondarev, welcome back to the show.
Good evening.
Darina Patyuk is Director of Operations at the Eastern Circles think tank. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me here.
Anton Kozlov, Director of the International Center for the Study of Eurasia. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. You can always listen to the show wherever podcasts are streamed. Yeah, long day of negotiating for the first day. That was Tuesday, but it was all over in under 2 hours on Wednesday, Camille night, on the round of talks that's wrapped up in a hurry in Geneva.
No breakthrough in talks to end the war in Ukraine as the Russian delegation leaves Geneva's Intercontinental Hotel, but some progress, according to the Ukrainians.
There is progress, but no details can be disclosed at this stage. The next step is to achieve the necessary level of consensus to submit the developed decisions for consideration by the presidents. Our task is to prepare a practical, not merely formal, foundation for this.
The talks were the third round of negotiations mediated by the US.
They went on for a very long time yesterday in different formats, and today as well for about 2 hours. They were difficult but professional. The next meeting will take place in the near future.
So far, the Kremlin hasn't wavered from its demands for Ukrainian territory, one of the main obstacles to a peace deal so far. Russia occupies roughly 20% of Ukraine, including large parts of the Donbass region, which it wants Kyiv to hand over in its entirety. Ukraine has always rejected this demand, but President Volodymyr Zelensky says there have been some developments on the military front more than on the political one, as he communicated with journalists after the talks. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has repeatedly suggested it was up to Ukraine and its president to ensure the talks were successful. Volodymyr Zelensky has hit back, saying it wasn't fair to keep calling on Kyiv to broker a deal. Where the negotiations go after this round of talks remains unclear.
John Herbst, in the last minutes, Ukraine's president saying he cannot say that the result is sufficient. The fact that it's rough going, that it's difficult, is something happening, or are both sides going through the motions?
It's important to note that Ukraine, Zelensky himself, has said yes to a half dozen peace proposals from President Trump. And Putin has said yes to none of those proposals. Zelensky has demonstrated from almost the beginning of Trump's second term his readiness to compromise on territory. It's also worth noting that President Trump says he wants a durable peace, one that does not lead to renewed fighting. And Trump's own proposals were based on current lines held by the two forces. The disagreements we're hearing about now, although not quite publicly, only muted in a public sense, is that apparently the administration is suggesting Ukraine should concede to Putin the highly fortified territory in western Donbass that Russian forces have failed in 4 years since the big invasion began to take. And I could understand why Ukraine would not want to give it up, because there's basically open territory, not easily defensible from the west of western Donbass all the way to Kyiv. So this is the problem at the present time. And frankly, it's not clear to me why President Trump is catering to the needs of the aggressor rather than to American interests on this subject to achieve the durable peace, which is his goal.
Okay, so
I
John,
think he's getting very bad advice.
he's getting very bad advice, you say. Very bad advice from whom?
Those who are involved in negotiating. Well, then actually not just those, but I mean, there are others we know in MAGA world who have no clue that Russia considers the United States to be its principal adversary, and Russia acts in a hostile manner against American interests in Ukraine and elsewhere.
All right, at the table in Geneva, the U.S. negotiating team of Trump's former real estate friend from New York City days, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. The New York Times writing up a profile this Wednesday where they say some Russians have taken to calling the duo Witkoff and Zyatkov because Zyat is Russian for son-in-law. What do you make, Boris Bondarev, of Witkoff and Zyatkov?
Well, I think it's the second year already that Steven Witkoff has been trying to achieve anything, some sort of a deal, peace deal between Russia and Ukraine and Russia and the United States, and he has so far achieved virtually nothing. And it's no surprise because he's doing the wrong job in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. And I think his basic incentive is very wrong and counterproductive because he ignores the true nature of the conflict and he doesn't want to hear about this true nature. It's not those root causes that Vladimir Putin has been talking about all this time, but the true nature is the aggressive nature of the Putin regime, which is bound to aggression, both outside and inside of the country. And so without solving this problem, solving of this Putin question, so to speak, there can be no sustainable peace between Russia and the West in general. So all this is just much ado about nothing.
Is it mission impossible trying to broker between Russia and Ukraine?
With this current U.S. administration views on the conflict and on the U.S. interests in this issue, it is not possible.
It's not possible. Let me ask you, Anton Kozlov, because let me play devil's advocate here. Some say you have a man who is not a career diplomat, who doesn't go into the weeds of the history of Ukraine, the history of Russia, what is everything that's happened since the fall of the Soviet Union. You get a pair of fresh eyes.
Well, you know what? A few months ago, when Witkoff talked to Tucker Carlson, he was absolutely persuaded that the League of Nations exists still today, and that the Ukraine and Russia will be able to join it once the war is over. So I think it's a question of being qualified to participate in international negotiations and to have a general framework of understanding of what's going on. I don't think I don't know.
So why did Donald Trump appoint this man?
Because Donald Trump is just like him. He doesn't have a clue. That's,
Doesn't have a clue, Darina Patiuk?
Well, I'm not sure if he doesn't have a clue, but for sure he doesn't understand something on this war, specifically on the nature of the conflict. I do agree with Boris, and the nature specifically on Russians' motivations. Because what we can see, who is ahead of the Russian delegation, Vladimir Medinsky. I mean, since 2022, he's ahead, and all the time it's been talks about the ideology, about the history.
Yeah, he's a former culture minister.
Exactly. So he's a historian. How can a historian talk about...
He's not a historian. Let me tell you something. He's a PR man. And he,
Better.
in 2016, his PhD in history was almost revoked by the National Commission on Doctoral Degrees because he was not a professional researcher, and he was saved by the Minister of National Education.
So how can this guy lead the delegation group of the negotiations on the war in Ukraine with this level of the military development technologies and the conflict?
All right, so Vladimir Putin's sending a message by sending him.
Exactly, and how we can also understand this is who was the head of the delegation group in Abu Dhabi. It was the guy from the General Staff of Russia, Igor Kostyukov. So he simply sent a signal that now we can talk seriously. But something had happened, and now he's again sending PR, PhD, pseudo-PhD historian to talk about the war in Ukraine.
Why did he send someone who was less serious, Boris Bondarev?
Well, I disagree with that General Kostyukov, Admiral Kostyukov, who is the head of the Russian military intelligence, was sent to Abu Dhabi as a sign of some serious attention by the Kremlin to the issue. No, I think it was just because it was framed as the intermilitary dialogue, so to speak. So the Kostyukov presence was just natural, and also it was his intelligence job to look out what's going on between Ukrainians and Americans, what they're working on, and so on. And I think that was his intelligence missions, first of all. And the second goal was to imitate some kind of intermilitary consultations. So everything that the Kremlin is doing in its foreign policy, it is done on purpose. And the purpose is to get the eventual victory over Ukraine, so to speak. So it's not that they take something seriously and take other things less serious. No, now it comes to political component of these so-called negotiations. A general cannot head the delegation which is to discuss political issues. It must be headed by some high-ranking diplomat or a presidential aide or something like this. And Vladimir Medinsky is a good choice because he's already been in these negotiations. They failed predictably, and he is now to fail again and again. That's his mission.
His mission to fail. John Herbst, do you want to react to what Anton Kozlov said earlier about there is no message being sent when Donald Trump names Steve Witkoff as his peace envoy or his mediator, if you will, between Russia and Ukraine?
I'll comment that indirectly, all right? I recall a few weeks after the 2024 presidential election, the incoming administration announced that Keith Kellogg would be the envoy for Russia and Ukraine. And I remember telling people at that time that Putin will ignore Kellogg and try to get all his work done by directly reaching out to Trump. But actually, Putin did better than that. He persuaded the Trump administration to remove the Russia file from Kellogg and to give it to Witkoff, because they realized Kellogg understood American interest, that Russia considers us to be its principal adversary, and we needed to take a hard look at what they do. And Witkoff came in, and he was clearly charmed by Putin, and we had a very different approach than we might have had otherwise. But that approach has not characterized the Trump team's approach at all times over the past year. There have been times where Witkoff's recommendations were clearly not followed. We saw that after Anchorage, and we saw that even when Putin called Trump just before Zelensky was due to come back to Washington in late October. Zelensky coming hoping to get the Tomahawks. Putin persuaded Trump not to give him Tomahawks, and then they announced there'd be a Putin-Trump summit. But Trump learned something from what happened the previous summer. And he said, I had to have Rubio talk to Lavrov first to see if there would be negotiations of successful negotiations at a summit. Rubio reported back Russians had not moved, and Trump then sanctioned Rosneft and Lukoil. But you see, a constant tactic for Putin with strategic significance is to euchre the president to take steps that do not aid Ukraine and hopefully eventually work against Ukraine.
And that
but
brings
Putin has not had full success with that.
Yeah, but that brings us to Geneva being actually a three-ring circus. There was the political discussions, as mentioned by the panel. There was some military discussions that took place over the last 2 days. We presume, you'll nod if I'm correct, that it's about prisoner exchanges mostly.
Exactly.
And then there is, while Medinsky was leading the Russian delegations, Vladimir Putin's usual envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, reportedly taking part in a separate working group on economic issues. But that one does not include Ukraine. The Kremlin has confirmed bilateral talks with Washington, first reported by the Bloomberg News Agency, of what the Ukrainian president has called the Dmitriev package. In it, you have such items as joint procurement promotion of fossil fuels, joint investment in natural gases, offshore oil extraction, and critical raw materials, something the Wall Street Journal reported on a few months back, and Russia's return to the dollar-based payment system. So there's this negotiation going on, John Herbst, is that to literally profit the Trump entourage?
Well, I don't want to comment on that specific point, that last point, although I remember the Wall Street Journal, the comprehensive Wall Street Journal story that you referred to. But it's very clear that, again, Putin's aim is to make sure that American support for Ukraine, of course, does not increase, but also diminishes. That's his game. And so they're waving all these economic baubles in front of the administration to help condition them to not stop Russian aggression, not to prevent Moscow from winning in Ukraine. That's the game. That's the play. But, as Bill Browder, who was one time the biggest Western cheerleader for investing in Russia, found out, almost no Western investors profit in Russia. While Browder was doing PR for Putin before his falling out, he found that his Krisha, his protection in the Kremlin, was not as great as his economic rivals in Russia, and that's how he lost control of his investments in Russia. And that's true for many Americans who've invested in Russia. But this is something that the Russians play with guile, with naive Westerners who know nothing about Russia's history, Russia's practice, and they get them to fall for it because Russia does have extraordinary natural resources, which they have never developed completely because the system is incompetent.
Ambassador Herbst, if the reports are correct, Dmitriev in Geneva and the Americans took the meeting.
Well, they've taken the meeting every time. And that's why when Trump sanctioned Rosneft and Lukoil, and Putin was stunned and concerned, he realized he had limited direct influence with Trump, limited, not none, and he dispatched Dmitriev to work on Witkoff. And that's how you got the not very credible 28-point peace plan that the U.S. presented in Kiev a few weeks later.
Coming back, Darina Patyuk from the Munich Security Conference, your view on how far Putin has gotten and how far he will get with this administration?
You mean with the American one?
Yes.
Well, what you can see is the marriage, I would say, between the narratives from the US and from the Russia. They're saying basically similar stuff, that Ukraine should give up the territories, security guarantees, maybe, but after the peace deal, that these even narratives on the history, they're quite similar. So what we can see from Ukraine is that America is not anymore as trustable partner as it used to be.
That's in words, but in deeds, Russia doesn't always get what it wants.
Yes, but now we're talking specifically about the peace deal. And on the table, there are the demands that Ukraine give up the Donbas region for the post-factum security guarantees by the US, which are completely Russian narratives.
Yeah, Donald Trump's testiness on concessions, telling on Sunday that Ukraine better come to the table, seems to be a hint at a Kremlin talking point that Ukraine give up all of the parts it still controls in Russian-claimed eastern territories, as expressed earlier by John Herbst. In the last 2 weeks, though, U.S. support breaking Ukraine's way, you might say, after Elon Musk flicked the off switch on Starlink coverage for frontline areas where Russians appear to have smuggled in his low-orbit satellites. Ukraine making its biggest single-week gains since June of 2023. The recaptured area, almost equivalent to the Russian advances for the entire month of December, 201 square kilometers. It's not much, Boris Bondarev, but what does it tell you? Is this just a temporary glitch at this point, just because they flicked the off switch on Starlink? And why did they flick the off switch on Starlink?
Well, the communications in the Russian army is very, very badly developed, and they have to borrow Starlink capacities and others. So I think they are now looking for ways to substitute these things with some other technologies. So maybe they will procure new Starlink terminals through Kazakhstan or some other intermediaries, and maybe they will restore their capabilities, communications capabilities in the near future. So we have to see. But yes, it shows us again that from technical point of view, the Russian armed forces are quite inferior to what Western armed forces can show, especially the United States. And that is why it's not very understandable why the United States, boasting that it is the mightiest military power in the world, and at the same time, the U.S. administration, both the Biden administration and Trump's administration, have shown such a great fear of any deterioration of relations with Russia, saying that Russia is such a powerful adversary. But we see that it is not so.
And we have, at the same time, so there's Starlink, but there's also Palantir, the company owned by Musk's former PayPal partner, Peter Thiel, and which recently opened a bureau in Kyiv. This before the January 26 launch of a partnership with Ukraine's government-backed defense technology cluster called Brave One. Together, they've created this platform where artificial intelligence models can be tested using sensitive military data, crucial for using drones on the battlefield. Darina Patyuk's Eastern Circle's newsletter explains why. You write in them that Ukrainian developers can train AI models using real battlefield data, starting with detecting and intercepting Shahed-type drones. Those are the ones made by the Iranians. It gives a potential for software, not hardware, to become the decisive force multiplier. Please raise our geek factor a little bit. What is a decisive force multiplier?
Yeah, so just let me begin with explaining what's actually going on with data in Ukraine. So we have massive amount of raw data about the drones, about the Russians, about Ukrainians, technologies, etc. So we do need a software that would analyze it, that would tell how to forecast the battlefield next steps, how to use the drones to target better, and etc. And fortunately or unfortunately, it demands really, really strong hardware, which we don't have in Ukraine. There is no such one in Europe. The only one is Palantir. So basically, Palantir is a data management system, which allows us to understand how to better classify our data, to predict, to plan, to create tactical movements that would win the war of attrition.
So what does that mean, predict? Like you're able to predict when Russia is going to launch a wave of drone attacks?
No, not really. It's about statistics. It's really about pure statistics, the possibilities, the correlation, etc.
And how much has that got to do already with these little gains that we've seen?
I feel that the nature of the contract between Palantir and Brave One, I mean, how exactly they cooperate, we don't have, unfortunately, access to this data. So what exactly they do with this data, we cannot tell, we don't know.
But in a drone war, will it sway things?
Well, for sure, what we also wrote in our report for NATO Aligned Combat Transformation we presented at MSC, Munich Security Conference, it's AI, which will define the future, not winner, but who will dominate the battlefield, as the one who analyzes the best, predicts the best, can then plan the best. So for sure, Palantir is connected to AI, so it creates the dominance for the party who has this technology and capacity.
So, okay, Anton Kozlov, we've spent the first 20 minutes of this show talking about how Donald Trump is using Kremlin talking points, about how he's pressuring Ukraine, how he's being lured to a degree by offers of lucrative contracts in the Arctic oil fields and the such. But then on the ground, concretely, Elon Musk and Peter Thiel doing business with Kyiv, not with Moscow.
Well, I think it's. Why are you surprised? Elon Musk is a sort of independent, sovereign figure. He can do business with whoever he wants to. The same thing about Peter Thiel. I don't think it is a question of Trump stopping Musk or Thiel. They're important enough people to do whatever they want. Besides, I think I'm sure they do have political support. I'm sure there are people in the Republican camp who back them in this business.
Yeah, because you have the theoretical, and you heard John Herbst describe the risk of doing business in Russia. For now, it's theoretical. Here, there's money actually being made on the Ukrainian side now. Will that sway Donald Trump?
I don't know. I'm not sure about that because I think Trump's attraction to Putin is not only money. I think it's also something very personal, something very, he is attracted to Putin because Putin is a criminal boss, and I think Trump likes criminal bosses, But the question about Musk, I think it's interesting that 4 years into the conflict, finally Musk decided to stop Russia's smuggled terminals. They've been working for 4 years. I mean, it's a well-known fact. I mean, you read any Russian Telegram channel from the side of the army, they all use Starlinks, and for 4 years. So they could have stopped that, 3 years ago.
So why now?
That I don't know why now. I think probably they figured that if they're going to stop the Starlink, the Ukrainians will have a better position to fight the Russians, and the Russians will be more flexible.
John Herbst, let me ask you the why now question. And do you agree with Anton that for Donald Trump, it's not just about money, his relationship with Vladimir Putin?
He's absolutely right about that. And in fact, I'm not sure that you can link the decisions taken by Palantir and Musk in the last few weeks to the administration. They are significant players on their own. But I do think that Trump has not been he's not all in right now on pressuring Ukraine. When Trump is all in, his public face is the face you saw from the middle of February last year until early March, when Trump was dumping on Zelensky multiple times a day, almost every day. And of course, when they shut off the provision of American military intelligence, which was a disaster for Ukraine, but also not a smart move for the United States. Right now, Trump made that remark, which everyone's talking about, that Ukraine has to move fast to the table. But they don't talk about the fact that Rubio said in roughly the same time period that, well, we'll find out in Geneva if the Russians are serious about negotiating. So even there was mixed messages from the administration. So Trump's not all in. But what we see with Trump's policy, and this is true now for almost a year, is on the one hand, he states he wants a durable peace, which means that the aggressor has to stop aggressing, meaning Russia. And sometimes he moves in that direction, but he doesn't move in that direction in a serious, methodical way, because, as already mentioned by my colleague, Trump has some sort of fascination, respect, whatever it is for Putin, which gets in the way of sound policy. Witkoff is trying to persuade Putin by offering flowers and candies. He needs to be offering 2x4s.
Do you agree with that, Boris Bondarev?
Well, I think when it comes to Donald Trump, you can never be confident about anything.
It must be a diplomat's nightmare, right?
I think he's a nightmare for his own team, first of all. And for instance, we see that they have at least two different approaches to foreign policy. First, that is conducted by State Secretary Marco Rubio, which is more cautious and less frivolous, and the other conducted by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, for instance, which is very much real estate thinking oriented, so to speak. It's different, and Trump seems to endorse both, and he doesn't go into details. So it's very interesting, to see. It would be very interesting to watch how this bromance between Trump and Putin will result eventually, if it wasn't if it weren't so important for all of us here. But yeah, I think we have only to see what is going on.
Yeah, and just a reminder, those talks in Geneva taking place over 2 days. There was Tuesday, there was Wednesday, and in the middle, on Tuesday evening, well, there were Russian drones landing as they do nightly on Ukraine, killing a woman, injuring a 6-year-old girl, as well as an 18-month-old toddler in Zaporizhia. Zaporizhia, which is that area where there's been the most gains last week when those Starlink satellite systems went silent. Darina Patyuk, that region, which is contested and which Russia controls part of, but not all of, is of course one of the keys, and not just because it's home to Europe's largest nuclear power plant.
Yeah, but mostly because of the Europe's large power plant, as it's occupied right now since 2022. And it brings us to the point that there is also disagreement on who is governing this nuclear station. The main problem is it's on the edge of a big catastrophe as Chernobyl 2.0. Why? Because right now there is a huge problem with the maintenance, as most of the components are Ukrainian. There is still American fuel, which is used to power the plant because it was used before the occupation, and it's quite hard to change all of this in such a short period of time. So, and the most important, the water which is cooling Zaporizhzhia nuclear station is from Kakhovska dump, which was also bombed by Russians recently in 2023, I suppose. So we can see that all the situations lead us to the catastrophe. Big boom that may happen in Zaporizhzhia region, which also will influence, of course, the European security if it happens.
Cheer up, it may never happen, Anton Kozlov?
Well, I think the Russians are playing this card. I think they're enjoying kind of, scare people to say, if you're not going to listen to us, well, that's what's going to happen. Whether we're there and how far we're from a disaster, who knows? I don't know. But I think, from what I witnessed, the Kakhovska water reserve was blown by the Russians.
Yeah.
For whatever, to prevent the Ukrainian troops to cross to the other side. But I think they're just, they're very cynical in this sense, because of course Chernobyl they had a fallout on the Russian territory as well, but I don't think they care that much. I think they don't think in long-term consequences.
All right, you talk about when do officials start to care. Last month, the U.S. think tank CSIS came out with a study that predicts that combined Russian and Ukrainian casualties could reach 2 million by this spring. That's both dead and wounded. A majority of them on the Russian side. According to this tally, they're already up to 1.2 million casualties, 17 times greater than during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s. Boris Bondarev, at what point in time do those casualty figures begin to matter to the Kremlin?
Well, there's been some news recently that there are some difficulties in finding replacements for these losses already. So there may be some feeling that something needs to be improved in the recruiting system. But still, I believe it's too early to conclude something seriously. So as for when this point comes, when the huge losses will affect the political situation in Russia, I think we are quite far from that, because the most population of Russia is not heavily, affected by the war. Russia is a highly urbanized country. About 80% of the population lives in huge cities, and big cities are not very much concerned. The most recruits come from rural areas, from remote areas, very poor regions, and they don't care about them much. So, and this core population, like Moscow, St. Petersburg, some other millionaire cities, they are guarded, so to speak, from mobilization, from recruiting. And so the level of life is there quite okay. People have plenty of time to adapt to slowly deteriorating situation. So still, I don't think that we will see in near future, like in a matter of weeks or maybe months, some drastic changes in public opinion.
Darina Patiuk, yeah, you haven't seen citizens of Moscow or St. Petersburg gang pressed into going to the front up to now. In Ukraine, you could feel the effects of the war, not just because of the power outages.
Yeah, we have a huge demographic crisis. Moreover, we can see it on the streets. We can see women. We don't really see a lot of men in the civilian form. Part of them are afraid, part of them are mobilized, and also we really don't have people to fight. But also the huge problem is that basically Ukrainians don't understand the whole strategy of the future of warfares, which means that if we'll know that, okay, we'll have this peace deal, then we'll have this time to reform the army, again, mobilize people, etc. It's one scenario. But right now we're in a scenario of strategic unknowns. No one understands what we should prepare for. That's why our government right now struggles with the strategies on how to mobilize people, how to cheer them up, whether they should prepare for the even
because public
elections.
Opinion is uncertain?
Public opinion is for sure uncertain. As you're in the wartime, your economy is dependent on the other countries. Russia is attacking your civilian cities each day. You don't have energy sector because of Russia. Of course, it's uncertain. People are sad and depressed. Imagine yourself being bombed by Russia basically each day with -20. You will be quite upset, I think, in these climates.
Well, John Herbst, when you think back to the Ukraine where you served at the time of the Orange Revolution of the early 2000s, and you look at today, the situation there, what are your thoughts?
Well, you see continuities in drastically different circumstances. I mean, the Ukrainians are proud people determined to be independent. And when I was there, of course, Putin tried to manipulate the election to ensure that Yanukovych, the Russian preferred candidate, won, and he failed because he didn't understand Ukraine. And he's not understood Ukraine down to this day. And that includes a fierce streak of independence vis-a-vis any distant ruler. Sadly, Ukrainian history over the centuries was one of distant rulers, whether they were in Constantinople / Istanbul, Vienna, or Muscovy, or for that matter, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And they developed a fierce streak of independence, which has served them well. And I agree that it's very difficult for them to live under Russian bombs. But as a former senior Ukrainian official from Kherson, who lived under Russian-occupied Kherson, and then in a Russian prison, it's terrible to live under Russian bombs, but far worse to live under the Russian occupation, given the severe repression of any sign of Ukrainian nationhood in Russian-occupied Ukraine. And that's why Putin's savage attack on the civilian population of Ukraine has not broken the spirit of the Ukrainian people. They have no choice but to fight this war.
And on the Russian side, if you take a camera and a microphone to Moscow's Red Square, you'll find that attitudes about the Geneva talks are, well, more or less within the margin of what might expect.
Compromises are needed not even on both sides, but worldwide. It would be good for all leaders to think and negotiate, rather than posturing, threatening, and rattling their weapons.
What compromises? We need to take Odessa, Mykolaiv, and Novorossiya.
The time for peace has come, and we've had enough of it. So I think the Europeans need to come to their senses a little and think about peace.
Europeans need to come to their senses. What does that mean, Anton Kozlov?
Well, because according to the Russian point of view, Europe is decadent. It's taken over by homosexuals and Satanist worshippers. And, they are completely to go into this kind of civilizational erasure. So, if they want to survive, they have to listen to what the Russians have to say. That's the basic discourse.
Boris Bondarev, is that what people feel in their hearts?
Well, they will never tell you what they do feel in their hearts, because there are some examples of people being prosecuted. So they tell into pollsters what they do feel and what do think about this. So people are very, very, they keep this to their heart. But if you ask them, they will tell you something. But Russia must be free from any threats, and we must reconcile with Ukrainians on our terms, of course. We are all very peaceful, but peace must suit our interest first. So it's very, very unwise to rely on these public opinion polls in Russia in this very, very unfriendly environment from the government, so to speak.
I fully agree. I think, those polls, they do not show much of anything except when they show that people want to have peace. Other than that, I think, when you have...
Okay, but when we went to, and granted, the last time the debate was in Moscow was 2018. It was a different time. But, people had nationalist pride when you were in Moscow. They were proud to be Russian.
Yeah, but I think Navalny was also proud to be Russian, But I think it's important to keep in mind that given the repressions that began whenever, 22, for this war in 22, when people were jailed for expressing a different opinion, nobody will tell you what they really think.
Darina Patyuk.
Yeah, but still Russia mobilizes 15,000 people per month. These people are coming from Russia, they're Russians, and they're still fighting in the war in Ukraine for the war for the Russia, which means there is still this idea that even if I don't like Putin, I don't like Russia, but I prefer money, which is given by the government to fight in the war and to fuel the war.
Because people in Russia are very poor. That's what it is. And they use that, they recruit poor people to fight, or prisoners who are willing to do whatever for 1 million rubles. That's a lot of money for them.
Right. And right now, the war in Ukraine inviting itself to what is billed as a show of peace, the Winter Olympics. First, there was the disqualification of skeleton rider Vyacheslav Heraskevich for insisting on wearing a helmet adorned with fallen Ukrainian athletes and coaches. Now comes news that Russian and Belarus athletes will be able to compete under their national flag at the upcoming Paralympics, a first since 2022.
Our game is sport. That means keeping sport a neutral ground, a place where every athlete can compete freely without being held back by the politics or divisions of their governments.
So, John Herbst, I'll spare you Darina's eye roll there, but what is your reaction?
I understand that position. I think it's a mistake. And I would not be surprised, but this is not something you could prove, that the change in approach which the Trump team brought in might have made it easier for the IOC to take that decision.
We'll leave it there for now. I want to thank you so much, John Herbst, for joining us from Washington. Boris Bondarev in Geneva. Darina Patyuk, Anton Kozlov, thank you for being with us here.
Thank you so much.
In the France 24 debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.